Thank you for joining us here again at Bible Truth and Prophecy. This is one of our favorite times of year, Christmas, to talk about an unspeakable gift given to us who don't deserve it. We like to talk about that gift and also all the things around that gift that show us that the birth of Christ was the birth of the Messiah. I hope someday that you'll get a chance to go to Israel, whether it be with Dr. Lindsted or myself, and even if not with us, that you'll get a guide who takes the time to talk about the customs and the culture and the things that might change your Western view or Westernized view of the Nativity. Now, I know if you've been listening to Dr. Lindsted here lately, he will have told you about the Nativity and the different things that we see and that we hear as customs and that we understand from multiple trips to Israel. But when you go with us or anybody else, you're going to go to the Church of the Nativity. And you're going to enter, of course, through the humble entrance where you have to duck down to get inside. And once you get inside, you're going to see this big, long line. It's usually 3 or 4 hours long. And this line is sitting there waiting to go down some stairs. And as you go down the stairs, you're talking and discussing, and it's just warm and hot, and you're just trying to figure out why you're going down these stairs. If you don't already know, they lead to a place like this little silver star on the floor. And when you get there, your guide is going to tell you that is the birthplace of Christ. On that exact spot, Jesus was born. And if you'll buy that, I've got some oceanfront property in Kansas I'd love to talk to you about selling. I don't think that's the birthplace of Christ. Do I think that this is in Bethlehem? Of course. Where was Christ born? Bethlehem. But to say that's the exact spot, I'm not convinced. And if you've listened to Dr. Lindsted recently, he'll explain why. Because when you look at the star, it's on the floor, not in a cave. And you see this picture here depicts a cave, and this cave is at what they call the shepherd's fields, where the Levitical shepherds would have been looking over the lambs that were ready for sacrifice or being born for sacrifice. And they would hewn out these caves to get stone to build a Migdal Adar, or a tower of the flock, where they could overlook the flock. And that would leave sharp edges around the cave. And so they would take these sheep, these little lamb, after they were born, and they would store them in the cave at night to keep them from predators. They would wrap them in swaddling clothes to keep them from getting a nick on their hoof or their leg or their ear or tail, anything of that nature that might disqualify them from being a suitable sacrifice. And so as we look at some of these pictures, I remember growing up, you see this beautiful wooden structure with these animals around and angels singing. And I think that Dr. Lindsted has probably done a very good job of taking these pictures and telling you they're not quite accurate. They're just not exactly what the Nativity would have been. Wood was way too precious to be building a barn out of. But rock, if you've been to Israel or when you go, you'll realize rock is very plentiful there. So to build a structure out of rock and to have a cave left over to house your animals is exactly how that would go. But if you go with us, Dr. Lindsted and myself, or one or the other of us, we're going to take you, instead of the line for the star on the floor, we're going to take you to a place called St. Jerome's Cave. So we are at the Church of the Nativity. We're in a cave underneath. Do we think this is the cave where Christ was born? No. But to get the sense of what's going on, we're at the Church of the Nativity, and we're showing you a cave we think representative of what it might have been like for the birth of Christ. You'll see all these little chambers back here, and you'll see some things that could possibly be stone mangers. Well, today I want to talk a little bit more as we think about this cave and tearing down the westernized idea of the Nativity. This depicts Mary and Joseph and Jesus in a cave. I'd like to say, how about instead of talking about the Nativity, we move forward and we try to change your mind or your outlook or your vision of what the wise men might have really been. And I've titled this, Who Were the Wise Men? And we'll begin our reading in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in those days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Who are these wise men coming from the east? You know, as a kid, I never had anyone explain to me who they were, and well, why were these guys from the east coming to find the Messiah? Who were they? How did they know to look for him that was born King of the Jews? And I think if we look at this word wise men, we see that it's really the word Magi. And there is no real translation for this word. It has to be transliterated. And so they say wise men, and they're actually referred to as wise men in several scriptures in the Old Testament. The term magos, or magi, is translated wise men 4 times and sorcerer twice. But some translations actually use the word magi in their text. They were really a priestly tribe of the Medo-Persian Empire. And as we look at this and we try to understand what these wise men were and why it's important to the Christmas story, I think you're going to understand when we're done that this is very important to the Christmas story and the birth of Christ. When you look at those words, and these are just some of the translations coming up and talking about the root of the word. In fact, the root of the word magi is actually rooted with the word magician for us. But these magi, or magos, were really an Eastern priestly group. They've been around since the time of Babylon and Ur, through the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire as Alexander the Great conquered the world. They were around during the Roman time, which was during the time of Christ. They studied astronomy, astrology, mathematics, and among other things, they made predictions about when to harvest, when to plant, things of that nature. But just as the Levites were to the Jewish people, the Magi were to the Medes. They've been around since, like I said, since Babylon and Ur. During the time of Christ, during the Roman Empire, the things they studied, astronomy, astrology, mathematics, things that would help them be predictive and help their king make wise decisions. And that all the way back to Ur, they were very prominent in the East and the Orient, even during the Greek and Roman empires. Fun fact about the Magi. And I know everyone's got a camel in their nativity, but they didn't ride camels. And I'm not saying you have to take your camel outside and shoot it or throw it in the trash. But just so you know, the Magi, or the wise men, did not come into Jerusalem riding on camels. They were priestly, they were highly honored, they were a very valuable person to the kingdoms. They rode Arabian steeds, the fastest, the best, the most beautiful Arabian steeds you've ever seen. The religion is almost a counterfeit of the Jewish religion. The fire was their principal element. And you can see this as they think about the Jewish people and they talk about the tabernacle. The presence of God in the tabernacle was a pillar of fire. They've kind of carbon copied the Jewish things. They're monotheistic. They had an altar with a burning perpetual flame on it. It kind of reminds you of the altar of incense at the tabernacle. They had another altar where they had a blood sacrifice was made, maybe like the mercy seat. The victim was sacrificed, then burned and eaten by the worshipers and the magician priests. That's an interesting thing to think about. Think about our communion and how we symbolize our place in the covenant with Christ by symbolically taking the bread and the cup as his body and as his blood that was shed for us. They were counterfeit of the religion in those days. And it was interesting, even as we look through scriptures, we see that Satan always wants what God has, but it's usually a lesser version or a horrible version of it that he's tried to make for himself. But as we go forward and we look at some more of these things, of these magi here, we think that they're very similar, of course, to the Jewish people in their religion. But we can see that they were heavily influenced by the Jewish people. Why was that? Why are they so heavily influenced by the Jewish people? The first mention of these Magi, or the first mention of the people of the Magi, were in Jeremiah chapter 39, beginning in verse 1 through verse 3. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army against Jerusalem, and they besieged it. And in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, the 9th day of the month, the city was broken up. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate. Even Nergal-Shazar, I have to say these names are very hard. Sam-Garinebo, Sennacherib, Rav-Saras, Nergal-Shazar, Rav-Mag, with all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon. Crazy names, right? But we have to start looking at these names and translating them. Look at Nergal-Shazar there. Well, he's translated as the Prince of Light. He's part of the Magi. Prince of Fire, as it were. He's part of the Magi. And that's why he's mentioned here. And that's where we first start seeing these Magi named. And the next one, Rav-Mag. Rav-Mag is a soothsayer, a magician, or chief soothsayer, the official of Babylonia. And that root word, of course, is magician or magi. So we see this priestly group all the way back in Jeremiah. We see that they're very important here. But still, we don't exactly know where they're going to get their heavy Jewish influence. We know that they're coming against Jerusalem right now. But where do they end up with this Jewish tone or Jewish understanding and way of worshiping and thinking? Well, for that, we have to go to Daniel. So if we go to Daniel, let me turn in my Bible here if I can get there quickly. If we go to Daniel, the book of Daniel, and we'll start to see exactly where this influence comes from. The book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Nebuchadnezzar has come now to Jerusalem, and the Lord has allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take over Jerusalem and to take Jehoiakim prisoner, captive. And as they're going through the city here, there's an interesting thing. It says, verse 3, And the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding of science, and had such ability to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So now we see that Nebuchadnezzar says, all right, bring the best of the best. Bring me the cream of the crop of the Jewish men, young men, with us so that we might teach them our ways and we might seek them for wisdom. Interesting here, verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. I'm sorry, let's go back to verse 6. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those names sound familiar? Let's continue on. Verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Now do they start to make sense who they are? Do you start to see who these young men are? They've changed their names to Belteshazzar, as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now I hope you know who those guys are. Something about a furnace and a fourth one likened to the Son of God. So we see now where the Jewish people are now being drawn in to the Babylonian Empire. We also see now that they're considered to be wise and cunning and able to be taught. What an interesting thing as we start to see this Jewish imprint on the Magi. But it goes even further than that. If we go to chapter 2 of Daniel, we might see something even more interesting there. Chapter 2 of Daniel says, "In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell the servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation thereof. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut into pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill." Think about that. How about that for a punishment? If you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to cut you into pieces and turn your house into a dunghill. Maybe we should start saying that to our children. Hey, if you don't do what I say, we're going to cut you into pieces. What an extreme way to look at this. But Nebuchadnezzar has never had a level head, has he? And as they go through this back and forth with the king, they keep saying, well, the thing you're asking, no one could do. There's not a man on earth who could do that. And they're right. There's not somebody on earth who could know the dream without being told it. And as we go through, we see this back and forth, and the next thing we notice, a decree comes out to kill all the wise men. And the decree finally makes it to Daniel, one of the chief guards, as it were, says, Daniel, we're going to have to kill you all because this has happened. And Daniel says, whoa, what's going on? Why are you going to kill the wise men? And he goes, and he stands before the king, and the king says, I have a dream that's been bothering me, and I don't know what the dream is, and I want to know the interpretations, and your wise men and magicians can't tell me. And what's Daniel say? Give me a minute. Give me some time to pray to my God to see if he will reveal these things. So we see now that Daniel is back with his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or in their real names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he made known this demand of the king, and they begin to pray. And we see that Daniel prays for this thing to be made known to him. And it says in verse 22 of chapter 2, he revealeth the deep and the secret things, and he knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. And I thank thee and praise thee, thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. And then Daniel, he goes back to Arach, and he says, I'm ready to see the king. And he goes to the king, and he says, I'm going to show you, this is verse 31, Thou, O king, sawest a bold and great image, this image whose brightness was excellent, and stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. And he begins to describe the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar sitting on the edge of his seat, he's like, you're right, that's what I saw. Oh, you're right, that's what I saw. And he keeps going, and he gives him this whole dream from beginning to ending, and he gives him the interpretation thereof. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do at this point? It says in verse 46 of chapter 2, Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer oblation and sweet odors to him. The king is worshiping at Daniel's feet because he knows Daniel's God is the holy God, the God of gods, the King of kings, the Lord of lords. And the king answered unto Daniel and said, Of truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secret things. Thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel's made the chief of the Magi of Babylon. I think you're starting to see where the Jewish influence over the Magi is coming in. And if you want to solidify that even more, you can look in Daniel chapter 4, verse 7 and 9, where he refers to Daniel as the chief of the Magi, the chief of the wise men. He is the cream of the crop when it comes to these guys. He's their leader. And as we go through, we see that there's a plot to kill Daniel. But it's not from the Magi. In fact, I think the Magi love Daniel. It's from the governors who can't stand that this Jewish man has been made over them. But I think as a good Jewish man, Daniel began to teach the Magi Jewish prophecies of the Messiah. That he'd be born of a virgin. That he'd be born in Bethlehem, but not just Bethlehem, but Bethlehem Ephrata. And so many of these things we see that I think Daniel would impart on these young men as they're growing up to be astrologers and magicians or sorcerers, as they would say, but more along the lines of chief counsel or predictors saying, hey, we should plant this month, or we should harvest this month. Or we see that the moon has gone through its phase. This is the great time to be working on our fields. And that the chief of the governors, they come, they try to get him to commit a crime against the king that requires his death. And it's just really interesting to see that this is 600 years before the birth of Christ. Daniel, a Jew, is made chief of the wise men. Now you can see why it's important that the wise men came from the east to find Jesus born in a manger. But he's a Hebrew prophet that has influence over this priestly group from the Babylonian Empire. Daniel is made their chief. He's the king of them all. And now that Daniel's a godly man, like I said, I believe he's teaching them to look for the prophecies. In fact, the governors hate him so much, you remember Daniel's thrown into the lion's den for worshiping a god that's not theirs. And one of the most interesting things, I think, as we see the king can't go back on his word, but I think the interesting thing is that he comes to Daniel before Daniel's thrown in the lion's den, and he says, I know your God is the God of gods, and I know he'll keep you through this. And what happens? Daniel's kept through it. 600 years before the birth of Christ. Now, back to Matthew chapter 2. We'll go back to Matthew chapter 2, and we'll kind of pick up where we were at just as we started. Only this time I'm going to read another verse. I'm going to start chapter 2, verse 1. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men, or Magi, from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star, remember they're astrologers, in the east, and we are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. Troubled. Herod is troubled. And that word troubled is very interesting. That word trouble is Strong's word G5015, tarasso, and it means to agitate, to cause inward commotion, to take away calmness of mind. My favorite is the last there, to strike one's spirit with fear or dread. So here we are, Herod sitting on the throne, and his spirit has been struck with fear or dread. You see, the West, the Roman Empire, were always afraid that the Persian Empire were going to invade and wage war on them and conquer them. And when you call the Parthian Empire, that battled Rome in the 55 BC, the 40 BC area time frame, there was a lot of war raging between those two. And they always fought along the Mediterranean coastline there. And I'm sure that Herod had seen his fair share of this. But he's troubled that these Magi, these Oriental Parthenon kingmakers, have arrived in Jerusalem to do what? To find he that is born King of the Jews. Interesting. And Herod must have said to them, what do you mean? I love the trouble on his face in this picture. He says, what do you mean? I'm King of the Jews. Caesar gave me that title himself. I'm the King of the Jews. I don't understand what you mean. You're here to find he that is born King of the Jews. But they're looking at a king-making unit from the east that's here to take down the west. 3 wise men. Why do they say 3 wise men? Because I'm looking at this and it says, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. My Bible doesn't say 3. Well, that's often a misinterpreted thing, saying 3 wise men, or we have a view of this because they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 3 gifts. But I might tell you that the wise men didn't travel as 3 little old men on camels carrying gifts. The wise men, or the Magi, traveled as an entire army. Hundreds of men on horseback that went through the lands, crowning kings and taking times to weigh in on important matters, wise things, and to take counsel with the leaders of the lands. It's interesting. As we look at this, we might see where Herod might be a little scared now. We got an army of kingmakers, very well-known, well-renowned, very important men who have rode in to Jerusalem and asked, where is he that is born King of the Jews? It's very interesting story as we start to put these pieces together. Interestingly enough, what did they come to do? They come to worship him that is born King of the Jews, proskuneo. They didn't come to wage a war, they came to worship. Because they knew from their chief, Daniel, that the Messiah was coming. And that he was a king and he was worthy of worship. The Gentiles, non-Jews, were here to worship him. He came unto his own, and they received him not. God-fearing Gentiles were some of the first to worship the King and the Messiah. You know, it's fascinating as we look at the declaration of Christ through the Gospels, and as we understand what these Gospels use to, or how they portray Christ, we see that Mark portrays him as a servant, and that Luke portrays him as the Son of Man, and John as the Son of God, but Matthew portrays him as King. And where are the Magi, the kingmakers? In Matthew, looking for he that is born King of the Jews. God has got to be what I would call the master planner of all time. Christ, the King, is born in Bethlehem, and the kingmakers from the Eastern Empire, the Magi who were taught by Daniel who to look for, have just ridden into town and said, we're looking for the King. And I'm telling you right now that God, in his wisdom and in his infinite power and the unaltered Word of God, our Bible shows 600 years before the birth of Christ, things were set in motion that the kingmakers would show up on the right day and say, we're here to see the King. The master planner of God himself. Men could not have put this book together 600 years apart for this to be an exact way that this scene would unfold. The Bible is true. We know it to be true. From cover to cover, it is intertwined more than any other book in the world. Men could not have done this. 2,600 years ago, from now, this plan was set into motion. That a Messiah would come, that a Savior would come, that we would have the opportunity to have our sins forgiven, that God, the Son of God, would take on the form of man, making himself a little lower than the angels. That he would be born of a virgin in Bethlehem Ephratah. That he would live a sinless life. And as a sheep before its shearers, he would be dumb. He would be quiet. And he would allow my sins and my transgressions and your sins and your transgressions to be placed on his back as he went to cross of Calvary. And he paid that debt, the debt I owed that I could not pay. And he humbled himself as he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And humbled himself to the death of the cross. He spent 3 days in a tomb. He rose again, was seen by many for 40 days, and now sits at the right hand of the Father. And he's overcome sin, and he's overcome death, and he's overcome hell. And he's paid that debt that we owe, that we can spend an eternity with him in heaven. Let me ask you today, have you ever made that decision? Have you ever placed your faith and your trust in Jesus for eternity? It's one thing to know it in your head. It's another thing to know it in your heart. You know, Herod was looking for the birth of Christ to try and wipe him out. And the Herodian stands right over the shepherd's fields where Jesus was born. He could have looked in those fields and seen it happen. He was right there, less than 3 miles, but from the top of the Herodium, you could see it. And he missed Christmas. I'm asking you today, are you knowing it but not trusting it? Are you missing it by 16 or 18 inches from your mind to your heart? Don't miss Christmas this year. Place your faith and your trust in him. So as we close today, I hope to take this version of the wise men that we all may have of 3 old men riding camels into the city with this version. Kingmakers riding Arabian steeds, coming to crown him that is born King of the Jews. So while you've had your time to look at these and to study these and understand this, I hope that while Dr. Lindsted may have changed your view of the Nativity from a barn to a cave, maybe I've done a little bit to change your view of the wise men and who they really were and how they knew to look for Jesus. Thank you for joining us. Merry Christmas. We'll see you next week.